New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we are going to ask the question of how were the most ancient beliefs in every culture about the afterlife derived? My guest is Gregory Shushan, who is a leading authority on near-death experiences and afterlife beliefs across cultures and throughout history. He is author of The Next World, Extraordinary Experiences of the Afterlife, and Near-Death Experience in Indigenous Religions. He also edited a book of William James' writings on psychical research titled Mind, Dust, and White Crows. Today, we will focus on his newest book, Near-Death Experiences in Ancient Civilizations, The Origins of the World's Afterlife Beliefs. Gregory lives in my old hometown of San Francisco, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Gregory. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. It's a pleasure to be invited back on again.
Your work encompasses some of the most ancient civilizations, and you've made a point of looking at our very earliest records from 5 different civilizations that evolved relatively independently of each other. We can't rule out any commerce between them, but it seems to be negligible in any case, with the idea that if their afterlife beliefs are similar, maybe there's some sort of a common basis for those beliefs.
Exactly. Very well summarized. Thanks. The idea of that was because these civilizations are geographically spread out around the world, chronologically distant from each other. So if you look at ancient Egypt to the ancient Aztec, which are the most chronologically distant of the ones I looked at, there's not really any possibility that the afterlife beliefs in one culture fanned out and influenced all the others. So the similarities then can't be explained by that kind of hypothesis. So I wanted to rule that out, essentially, so somebody couldn't come in and say, well, it's the same because of diffusion of the myth. And instead, I thought if you look at a common experience that they might be having, which might be influencing their beliefs, that might be a more persuasive argument. And given that near-death experiences are so relevant to beliefs in an afterlife, it seemed like a good place to start looking.
I think it's an excellent approach, but I do know that there are some historians who try to relate the pyramids of Egypt to the pyramids in Mesoamerica.
Yeah, I think that's really a non-starter. I think it's a really speculative argument based on just kind of general visual similarities. They weren't really, they're so far distant in time and geography. There's no evidence of Egyptian culture left along the way between Egypt and Mesoamerica. There are no Egyptian artifacts in Mesoamerica. So I think it's really just one of those things where people see a similarity and they think, oh, they must be related. And there's really no evidence for that at all.
I know when I was in Egypt. Egyptologists there like to talk about the idea that maybe there was an earlier Atlantean civilization that preceded the Egyptian culture, and it may have also had an influence in other parts of the world. I realize that's highly speculative, but I know people like that theory or hypothesis.
Right, yeah, and it's very popular now with, or at least similar things with Graham Hancock's work and all of that.
Yeah.
But again, I came from, I started out in archaeology, Egyptian archaeology and Eastern Mediterranean archaeology. So the whole approach of that field it's very, very highly evidence-based. So unless there's tangible, hard evidence, to me, everything else is speculation. You can make up whatever story you want about Atlanteans or ancient aliens or whatever, but there's usually the things that people hold up as examples of that are explainable in mundane ways in reference to the culture. So just a quick example. A lot of people might be familiar with these claims that these hieroglyphs show helicopters and flying saucers. I think it's at the Temple of Dendera. And what is demonstrably the case is that one pharaoh had his hieroglyphic name stamped over that of another when he became king. And you can actually see, if you superimpose the two hieroglyphs on top of each other, you can see how the helicopter form was made and the spaceship form was made. But they were two separate hieroglyphs superimposed.
Very interesting. Well, our focus, of course, it will be on the afterlife. And from my point of view, I think it's fair to say that there are many avenues by which a human being can approach the afterlife, and probably the most dominant of those, certainly in Western culture since 1975, has been the near-death experience. But there are also dreams, mystical states of consciousness, mediumship, and so forth. So there are many different sources. How do you relate to that? Because I know you have a narrower focus on the near-death experience, particularly. Right.
The reason I focused on NDEs so much is, in distinction to all those other phenomena that you talked about, it's the only one that's spontaneous, really. Well, mystical states maybe could be spontaneous, but for the most part, an NDE isn't a culturally situated phenomena. It's not like a shamanic journey where somebody decides they're going to go to the other world and facilitates that by, use of hallucinogens or, dancing and drumming and things like that. It's something that happens externally to you. And that's a big distinction in my mind. So the fact that it's a spontaneous, unsought, unexpected experience happening in all these cultures all around the world, I think is a huge difference than mediumship happening everywhere around the world, which is there are different mediumship techniques in different areas.
Let's begin with ancient Egypt. That's certainly, along with Mesopotamia, a candidate for the oldest culture. I suppose scholars would say the Mesopotamian culture might be somewhat older. I'm not even sure these days. But if I recall correctly, the Egyptians don't explicitly reference the near-death experience, even though they have many elaborate descriptions of the afterlife.
Exactly. Yeah, they didn't have the context for the reporting of personal experiences in Egypt. Writing, especially in the earlier stages, was used only for priestly ritual kinds of texts, like the pyramid texts and the coffin texts and things like that. For royal texts, royal decrees and monumental architecture, naming the king and the feats of conquering that he'd done and things like that. And then for bureaucracy, how many sacks of grain were sold, divorce decrees, even things like this. There weren't even literary tales until the Middle Kingdom. And so I started looking at the pyramid texts, which are the earliest, written only in the coffins the pyramids of kings carved into the walls, and then later the coffin texts. These both preceded the Book of the Dead. And so in all of these texts, they're basically guidebooks to the afterlife. So they're telling us what to expect when we get there, how to negotiate the perils, how to recognize yourself and the way you're going to proceed in the other world, and things of that nature. But I think the implication there is obviously that somebody knows what it's like there and came back and was able to talk about it. Otherwise, these texts couldn't exist. So I think the context of their existence even kind of implies a belief in somebody who had been to the other world and returned. But then aside from that, a lot of the elements of the text actually mirror near-death experiences. So if you strip back some of the cultural layers, you've got entering darkness, emerging into light, meeting a being of light in the form of the sun god Re, an Egyptian sun god. Your deceased relatives are there. There's some kind of evaluation of your earthly life, not exactly like a panoramic life review, but thematically it's similar. And then there's transformation, kind of transcendental experience where you become this divine-like being who's associated with the various deities. It's a place of renewal, wisdom, rebirth, and all those kinds of themes that are typical of NDEs.
I'm under the impression that the Book of the Dead and the earliest Egyptian writings were strictly for the royalty at the time. It wasn't considered that the average person even had an afterlife. Is that correct?
That's been a subject of debate for a while. It's true that the texts were only for the elite. Like I said, the pyramid texts are only in the pyramids of kings and a couple of queens. And then when the coffin texts appeared, which are basically something like 3/4 of them are the pyramid texts, they're written only in the coffins of the elite. People who can afford to buy these coffins, pay for them to be inscribed with these maps of the underworld and all these ritual formulae. And then gradually they become available on papyri, which kind of anybody can afford, a scrap of papyrus with these ritual texts on them, or even on potsherds, they can have them. So gradually the access to these texts became more available to people at all levels of society. But even going back to the pyramid texts, when they're only on the pyramids of kings, there are references to different fates in the afterlife. So some people become servants of Osiris. Some people go to the field of rushes, which is like a kind of happy hunting ground kind of place, a place of opulence and plenty. Some people become divinized. They become one with the sun god. So that implies that there are a diversity of fates for different people, as well as the fact that there are judges in the other world. So I think all of that sort of suggests that there was an afterlife for everybody. It's just there's not a lot of evidence beyond the text.
Ancient Egypt was a particularly long-lived culture. It lasted for thousands of years and went through various phases. And I gather that the approach to the afterlife in different phases of Egyptian culture also changed.
And an interesting thing about that is, as far as the afterlife being more focused on the royalty and the elite, as time went on, there are more and more descriptions of punishments and hells. It becomes more of a divisive kind of afterlife. And I think that's because it became, I don't think it originated as a tool of control from the elite, but I think it became that as it grew more accessible to the populace. So the addition of these threats of punishment, I think, was a way to kind of attempt to control the masses, as it were.
And I'm also under the impression that the idea of a Book of the Dead that arose in Egypt became something of a literary genre, so that if I'm a person who is about to die, or my family has to deal with my funeral arrangements, they will go to a scribe to have a Book of the Dead prepared, and the scribe is going to follow a certain literary tradition that gets passed on. And something like that is probably true in just about every culture where you have a mix of experiences reported, like near-death experiences, or I happen to think dreams also play a very prominent role. But then you've got a cultural overlay.
Right. I mean, with the Egyptian text, it was essentially the same text, but prepared differently for each different person. So their name would be inserted, but essentially it was the same text. It wasn't totally customized to each person. But yeah, and I think all of those kinds of experiences also, play into the afterlife beliefs, and they were often seen as going to the same type of realm. The afterlife realm was one and the same as the dream realm, the shamanic realm, and things like that.
I know, for example, there's some very interesting literature coming out of the Jungian camp suggesting that there's a real overlap between what we could call the Bardo planes, the afterlife, and the collective unconscious or the realm of dreams.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, the way I look at the Jungian kind of argument is I find it to be a descriptive one. It kind of describes how we have these kind of common well of symbols and ideas cross-culturally, but it doesn't explain their origins. And that's kind of where I feel like it's an interesting way of thinking about it, but it's not an explanatory way of thinking about it.
I know, just to push a little bit on that, Jung himself seemed to claim that he could tell the difference between a normal dream where an archetypal figure appears in the dream and what he sometimes would call a visitation. He talked about a dream of his father, and he didn't say, I dreamt of my father. He said, my father visited me in the dream.
Right. And he also famously had his own near-death experience where his doctor appeared to him in this kind of spiritual form. But an interesting, and also this really cosmic, cross-culturally rich, dynamic NDE where he saw a Hindu priest in a temple carved out of a meteorite surrounded by flames floating in space. So it obviously was very much enriched by his own knowledge and experience. But he also reported the NDE of one of his patients. And what I find really interesting about that is in his discussion of that and in his discussion about his own NDE, he didn't seem to make the connection between the two. He didn't discuss them in relation to each other. And that was always puzzling to me, and it made me wish that he had maybe delved into the whole NDE idea a little bit more.
Yeah, I think Jung was a little bit afraid that he would ruin his own scientific reputation if he went too far in that direction.
Right. And of course, there was no term for near-death experience back then. So it was more, I think, of a confusing kind of element, kind of experience that people they didn't have the term near-death experience to hang on to it. So they would, I think they were recognized cross-culturally and in different religious beliefs, but they weren't sort of brought together as a phenomenon until Moody came along, really.
Moody, and I think the same year, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote a book on near-death experience, 1975.
Yeah, and the year before, actually, there was a German writer who wrote, God, it's escaping me right now, but he wrote a book about near-death experience published in Germany the year before Moody, and then it came out in America the following year. To Die is Gain is the title of the book. But the author's escaping. But it's really interesting because he approaches the subject from the perspective of a theologian rather than from a psychologist. So his book is all about the mystical and sort of theological aspects of the NDE. A very different approach from Moody. He was less interested in scientific evidence for an afterlife. He sort of accepted that they were evidence for an afterlife.
Getting back to ancient Egypt, I know during the very lengthy history of thousands of years of different dynasties, but essentially a dynastic culture that lasted even after Greek leaders took over. There was a strong Egyptian culture. There were stories of magicians were very common. Egyptians seem to have a fascination with the idea of magic. You can even detect that in the biblical accounts of ancient Egypt with Moses and the magicians of Pharaoh and so on. And some of these magicians, I gather, were able to travel back and forth between the worlds.
Yeah, the best evidence for that is there are a couple of literary tales much later, I think 5th century BCE, something like that, of a magician who travels to the underworld and has all these adventures there and then returns. There are some NDE-like elements, but it's very clearly a story. It has a plot, it has a background, and it doesn't seem to be intended to be taken as a documentary sort of account. But it's nevertheless interesting because it has these elements of it seems to take place in the body rather than with an out-of-body experience. But still, the deceased relatives are there. There's a deity that's encountered there. The magician's past deeds are a factor in how the story plays out, and then of course he returns to the body.
Would you say, as some scholars have, that it's very hard for a modern person to enter into the mindset of these ancient people who lacked all of the technology with which we're so familiar and our materialist values? Many scholars suggest that in those most ancient times, people didn't have the same distinctions that we make between the internal world and the external world.
I think that's probably true. I mean, with the Egyptian texts, they've been translated and retranslated since the Rosetta Stone was deciphered in 1798 or whatever it was. So we understand basically what the texts say, and we understand most of what they mean, but we can't understand what they meant to individuals and the feeling and belief that was behind them. There's a lot about them that still remain obscure, and especially because they were written to be, esoteric texts and have these esoteric meanings. There's also ritual dimensions. So there's symbolic language in the pyramid texts that's describing what the soul is going through in the other world, but is also describing the physical burial process of putting the coffin into the tomb, the relatives leaving the offerings for the mummy, but then those offerings then go to the spirit in the other world. So there's these really multi-layered kind of meanings to these texts. And it's the same in other parts of the world too, especially with India, with the Rig Veda and other texts.
It seems to me that one of the primordial myths that you find in almost all cultures, and is certainly very evident in Christianity, is the idea that some heroic figure can die, be completely dead, and then return to the world of the living. You find that certainly in the myth of Osiris.
Right. Osiris is definitely one of the earliest. I don't consider his story to be an NDE because he's a deity and we don't have a kind of core account, a story of what happened with his death and return until Plutarch. We have descriptions of what's going on embedded in the text that have to be kind of pieced together, but it's not until much later that we have the narrative. And then we've got, things like the myth of Inanna in ancient Sumer, where she travels to the other world. She goes there specifically to overthrow the queen of the underworld, Erishkagala. And there's all these plot elements where she takes 7 aspects of what they call me, which is kind of like it's mirrored in Egyptian Mat or in Indian Rita, these kind of principles of the universe, the founding moral ground and ethical ground of life. And she sheds each one of these kind of earthly accoutrements on her way to the underworld. So there's all this kind of symbolic things going on which all serve the narrative and teach moral lessons. To me, that's very different than a documentary NDE, which happened to a real individual, a documented person in history. And interestingly, those NDEs, those accounts, don't have the same kind of plot elements. They're not so much of a story. And I think the first example of that is probably Bilgamesh, who is which was the Sumerian name for Gilgamesh. A lot of people probably know the Epic of Gilgamesh. There's a sort of deleted chapter from the epic that only concerns Gilgamesh, who was an actual historian king. And it tells about how he was lying on his deathbed, his soul left his body, he traveled to the other world, and he met the sun god, Utu, who was obviously a being of light, once again. This god, along with a panel of other deities who are radiating light, they assist in his life review. It's not a panoramic life review, as we know, but it's a kind of assessment of his earthly deeds according to what was ideal in that particular culture. So he built temples and sustained temples and protected the people and provided for the people as a king, that kind of thing. And then they decide what his fate is going to be. They decide he's half divine and he's going to be a judge in the underworld. There's a banquet and a feast held in his honor, so that kind of symbolizes the joy that near-death experiencers talk about. And then he becomes a judge in the underworld, which is the transformational aspect of NDEs. And then he returns to his body in order to kind of get his affairs in order, prepare his tomb, and prepare all of his offerings that will come with him to the afterlife. And then he goes and becomes this judge in the other world. So even though it's got this element, the story of him going there, coming back, preparing his tomb, and transformation as a judge, it's still, because of the fact that he was a historical individual, and it lacks these kind of mythological elements to it. I think it qualifies as possibly the world's first NDE.
Very interesting. The story of Bilgamesh. We can call him Bill, I guess.
Yeah. And these texts were only translated, 30 years ago or something. They were kind of, they were neglected for quite a long time in Sumerian studies and Assyriology in general.
Sure, I learned about the Epic of Gilgamesh as an undergraduate, but I never heard of Bilgamesh until today, or reading your book, actually.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
One of the things you point out is compared to the other ancient civilizations in India, probably the Indus Valley civilization being the oldest there, what evolved in ancient India was not just descriptions of the afterlife that were culturally relevant, but also a philosophy, a whole metaphysics that we don't find so much in ancient Egypt, even though it's full of descriptive elements.
Yeah, I think the metaphysical system was probably there, but again, they didn't have the context. I think they didn't even think about it in terms of, we need to write this out in a way that describes and explains everything going on in the text. There's no exegesis tradition. It's like, here's the text. The priests know what it means. That's all you need to know.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think it was there. I think it's just we can't access it up to a certain degree. But yeah, with India, with the Rig Veda is also a ritual text. For the most part, it's priestly ritual texts that were meant to be recited during things like the fire sacrifice, and a lot of the rituals were related to the afterlife and for the soul transitioning to another state in the other world. But what's missing from the Rig Veda and the other Vedic texts up to the Upanishads, for the most part, is reincarnation. There seems to be hints of it here and there. But what's interesting about that is we have this kind of series of death and return myths, starting with, there's one in the Rig Veda about a little boy whose father is the god Varuna, the god of the moon, and he sends him to the other world, and he comes back to life. There's not a lot of detail there, but the story gets repeated and elaborated upon over centuries. And then in the Upanishads, it's about a little boy named Nachiketa. Suddenly he has a name, and suddenly the story is a little more like a near-death experience. It kind of evolves in this way. But at a certain point, after reincarnation is introduced in the kind of Upanishadic post-Vedic period, these stories taper off, and we don't have so many death and return stories as seemed to be the case in the earlier texts. And like in the Atharva Veda, for example, it's a kind of magical medical text, and there's descriptions of NDEs in there, not personal accounts, but they show that they know about them because they talk about here's how to save somebody who's having an NDE and bring them back to their body. But eventually, I think what happens when reincarnation is introduced, the death and return context is no longer that important. There are still descriptions of the afterlife, but it's more in the sense of this is the intermediate realm. You need to know how to negotiate that intermediate realm so you can facilitate a better rebirth in your next life, or ideally getting off the wheel of rebirth and be liberated. So we can kind of chart these changes over time with near-death attitudes towards a near-death experience being a nice kind of signpost along the way.
Here's something that puzzles me. I am under the impression that pretty much every ancient culture has a notion of judgment, that after you die, there is a figure like a judge who is going to examine your deeds, and you will be assigned to a location in the afterlife or a rebirth based on an assessment, a judgment of how well you did in your most recent life. But I'm under the impression these days that many near-death experiencers come back and they say it's all about unconditional love. The only person judging you is yourself. There's no other judge. And I wonder if you've given any consideration to that distinction.
Yeah, that's a good point. There is, the life review is kind of a self-assessment, and NDEers even talk about they felt all the emotions of everybody in their life who they've impacted, positive and negative. So if you hurt somebody, you're going to feel their pain. If you did something kind to somebody, you're going to feel that kindness, but all at once. And then the being of light is often there as a kind of facilitator of the experience, but not as a judge. It's, as you said, this unconditional love emanating from him. But I think there are parallels in some of the ancient texts. For example, in India, this principle that the Atman, which is the inner unchanging self, it's the thing that survives death and is reborn in the next life. There's a stress that the Atman is one and the same as Brahman, which is the absolute ultimate reality, the universal transcendent totality of everything. Mm-hmm. And so in that sense, if Atman is Brahman, any kind of judgment going on is the self doing the judgment of the self. And it's mirrored in other cultures as well. Even in Egypt, there's this constant association of the soul of the dead with Osiris, who is the judge of the dead, and with the sun god Re. So again, it's kind of, you are your own judge. If you are Osiris, and you encounter Osiris in the other world, and he's carrying out judgment, then that's effectively you judging yourself.
Let's talk about China, another very ancient culture. How would you say the Chinese view is different from their neighbors in India or Mesopotamia?
The Chinese situation is really interesting because they had a formal system for documenting actual near-death experiences of historical individuals. So with Egypt, I was able to only look at descriptions of the afterlife in light of NDEs. In India, I was able to look at references to NDEs and those return from death stories and the beliefs. Sumer, I had the mythologies of the return from death stories of Inanna, the one NDE of Gilgamesh, and then their afterlife beliefs. But with China is the first one where we have actual documentary NDEs. And there's a great example of a man named Qianxi. This is around 750 BCE, I think, where he's lying on his deathbed. He's sick with a fever, and he travels to the other world, and he meets the Emperor of Heaven. And there are all these, familiar elements of NDEs, meeting the Emperor, the deity of heaven, the traveling to the other world, the deceased relatives, and all that. But then there are these very particular cultural elements. For example, two bears appear and they attack this Emperor of Heaven, and Qianxi is there just in time to save the emperor from attack from these bears. So in in appreciation of that, the emperor grants him, a favorable life on Earth when he returns, and very specific things, like he says, "There's a particular dog in this province, and I want your son to have it." These kind of predictive things, which will then later be proven correctly, which show the veridicality of the NDE. But then, most importantly, as he's standing there talking to the Emperor of Heaven, he sees standing at his side a little boy. So he's then sent back to his body. Years later, he's walking down the street in a different province, in a different city, and a man won't get out of his way. This man is standing in his path and kind of making eye contact, and he won't move. And he's looking at him and thinking, "This guy looks familiar. What's going on here?" And he says, "Who are you? Do I know you?" And the man proceeds to describe the near-death experience that Qianxi had years ago. And then finally it emerges, he says, "I was the little boy standing at the side of the emperor." So this is an amazing, to me, example of a veridical NDE where two people happen to be having NDEs at the same time and coincidentally met in the afterlife and then encountered each other later in life. And so this was seen by the Chinese authorities as, evidence of the veridicality of NDEs. It supported their views about the afterlife, and also supported, kind of political predictions and things that were made during the NDE. And the account was well documented. It said, this happened to this individual on this date. It was witnessed by so-and-so person in so-and-so province. And it was officially lodged, like in the government bureau of documents. And there are quite a few examples like that. There are, in fact, volumes of NDEs from ancient China that have not been translated to English.
This is really fascinating. Let me ask you, though, are there accounts that you know of where two people meet each other and share an NDE and then both come back and recognize each other?
This Chinese example, they didn't know each other. So in a way, that's even more veridical to recognize each other later. But an example where they do know each other, the only one I can think of that's kind of pre-modern is a early Christian account from ancient Carthage, which is a province of Rome. And this is the era when Christians were being persecuted by the Romans before the Christians started persecuting the Romans, before the tables turned. And essentially, Perpetuo, who later becomes a saint, and Sartorus are in a cell awaiting persecution in the Colosseum in Carthage. And they have a shared near-death experience, and they describe ascending a ladder to heaven and meeting God and having various experiences on the way of this ladder. I think the ladder is, if this is a real NDE, the ladder would kind of symbolize the passageway through the tunnel or whatever. So there are a lot of NDE-like elements, and the context is essentially, they died at the same time of starvation and deprivation while they were in this cell.
It reminds me of an obscure story that was published in a book called Breakthrough to Creativity, written by a psychiatrist, Shafika Karagula, many years ago, back in the 1960s, I think, where she had a patient. She called the patient Violet, as I recall. And this patient reported in her sleep every night going into a dream in which she's sitting in a classroom receiving various forms of esoteric instructions. And this went on for some time. And at one point, Karagula asked her patient, "Do you recognize anyone else in the classroom?" And she said, "Oh, yes, there's a person I know. He lives in New York, a long way away." And she reached out to that person, and apparently the person confirmed that he had also been having those same repetitive dreams. So it suggests, that dream sharing, which would be like sharing an experience in the Bardo plane, can occur, and can be documented.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's probably the case. Just the fact that there are, even if there are a few of them, the fact that they exist at all, like this ancient Chinese example or the ancient Carthage example, I find it really fascinating that it's not just NDEs, it's specifically a concern for veridical NDEs. We also find that in other cultures through Native American accounts, not so much of shared NDEs, but a concern for them being taken seriously. Sometimes it's things that stretch my bounds of credulity, so they're given an object which they're supposed to then bring back to this world to prove that they were there. I don't see how that could happen. And then in other cases, they scratch a symbol on a tree to show that, they did that while they were in soul form on their way back to their body. But yeah, this concern for the account to be taken seriously, I think is really interesting.
There is quite a bit of literature. I don't know if it's relevant. I think it probably is, because it seems to me there's an overlap between the near-death experience and things like the UFO abduction cases that occur, and other types of dream experiences, possibly involving incubi and succubi, where people awaken from such an experience and they have marks on their body.
Right. Yeah. Or even stigmata, things like that. There are definitely, things on heaven and earth beyond our philosophy. but I think the alien abduction stuff, I think that's probably more related to sleep paralysis than to near-death experiences. That's what it seems like to me, anyway. This idea that David Hufford, I'm sure has done this research on sleep paralysis. He had a wonderful book in, I think, 1982, The Terror That Comes in the Night. Yeah. And he was able to show that sleep paralysis is a cross-culturally recurring phenomenon. This is when the person, you're in this half awake, half sleeping state. They call it the hypnagogic state. And it can happen either when you're just waking up or just falling asleep. And you're convinced that you're awake. It's almost beyond a lucid dream in a way. You don't feel like you're in another location. It's not a dream state. You feel like you're in the actual bed where you're sleeping. And you have a sensation of pressure on your chest. You're immobile. You can't move. You can't scream. And there's a malevolent presence in the room, either holding you down or somewhere else in the room. And so he was able to find this cross-culturally and found that each culture ascribes a different identity to the malevolent presence. So it's an old hag in Newfoundland, it's a hungry ghost in Japan, and so on. And I think there's been some research comparing that to alien abduction and the same types of feelings and phenomena that abductee victims report.
I'm not aware of very much evidence that people who have near-death experiences come back talking about aliens. But there is a certain amount of evidence, particularly from Whitley Strieber, a very famous abductee, who says that he is taken aboard a craft, and who should he see along with the non-human being he's having sex with, but a friend of his who died 10 years ago, who's watching the whole thing.
Yeah, I know. I don't know what to make of those accounts. I mean, my whole notion of NDEs is that it's an objective experience with these. In the book, I talk about these kind of 9 elements of NDEs that seem to be transposed on the afterlife beliefs of all of these civilizations. And they're the things I've been talking about, like leaving the body, seeing the corpse from a vantage point outside the body, entering darkness, the being of light, the relatives, and so on. These are all culturally expressed and actually culturally experienced by the individual. I don't think it's a matter of they have the experience and then they come back and add their cultural layers to it. I think they're experiencing it as an enculturated person. And so this is why Buddhists will see the Buddha and Christians will see Jesus and Muslims will see Muhammad and so on. So I think if we apply that to the alien abductions, maybe there is a correlation with near-death experiences, and the way their minds are working is layering alien UFO lore onto these kind of objective experiences. Kind of their minds are projecting that symbolism onto the experiences.
Well, let's also talk about Mesoamerica. It was relatively isolated from the rest of the world, as you point out, both in time and distance. So that makes it important. And I know for myself, it's a difficult subject because of all of the horrible forms of mutilation. I read these accounts from the early Spanish explorers of captive slaves lining up to have their hearts cut out of them while they're living. And it's like, I don't want to know anymore.
I mean, it's a difficult subject in that way, but when you read the Aztec poetry and texts about the afterlife, you would have no idea that those practices were going on. They're about flowers and songs and butterflies. I mean, they're really kind of wonderful, sweet poems. And they talk about just like in any other culture, they talk about the soul going to live with the divine, meeting the various deities in the other world and living this kind of life of bliss and paradise. The only hint of that kind of violent traditions that goes on is, warriors have a certain kind of afterlife that's preferential, but then so do women who die in childbirth. So people who commit suicide have a preferential afterlife, which is totally the opposite of the way our culture looks at suicide, or that Christianity looks at suicide. So there is there's a degree of cultural relativism that I think we have to have when we look at these kinds of civilizations, and try not to judge their beliefs and their texts by virtue of their practices. And especially when you flip it around and the Spaniards didn't treat the Aztec any better than the Aztecs treated their captives. And they did it on a wholesale kind of, it wasn't, in Aztec and Mayan culture, it was mostly, well, Maya especially anyway, it was volunteers who volunteered to be sacrificed, and it was seen as an honor. With the Spaniards, it was just like, kill them all and let God sort them out, basically. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think it's a tricky thing to try to get beyond the abhorrence of some of those descriptions, and still see the society as a rich, diverse, interesting, unique society like any other. They weren't all about blood and sacrifice.
Well, how did they approach the near-death experience?
There's actually a great example from the Aztec world. The first example we have was reported by a Spanish missionary named Bernardino de Sahagún. This was in the 16th century, I believe. Even though he was a missionary, he was an enlightened missionary. He learned the local language. He was an excellent ethnographer for the time. This is before the concept of ethnography even existed. But he very faithfully recorded what he heard. And he sought out elders in the community, priests and shamans and people who knew what they were talking about. So when he asked them about their afterlife beliefs, they told him the story of a princess who, again, was an actual historical figure. So I consider this to be a legitimate NDE. She was killed by her father-in-law, who was an Aztec ruler named Moquihish, again, a historical figure. And she's buried, and while she's in her tomb, she has this full-blown NDE. She is met by what she described as a sickly, deformed youth. And this person leads her on a tour of the other world, and she meets deceased relatives. She meets previous Aztec rulers. There's a kind of evaluation of her life. And then she's given prophecies about the coming of the Spaniards. So it actually happened before the Spanish arrived. So unfortunately, the last page of this document is missing, frustratingly. But the assumption is she came back to life and told people about it, because that's where Sahagún got the information. So fast forward 30 or 40 years, there's another account from another source of a woman in a neighboring community who had an NDE. And it's very similar to the one of Quetzalcoatl, the name of the first one. But there are a few differences. It's kind of unclear whether it's the same account elaborated or if it's a totally different woman. But with that one, we have a description of she bursts out of her grave, and the stones and dirt that were piled on top of it go flying everywhere. So they kind of dramatically, they made up for the missing page of Sahagún's version. But then we fast forward another 100 years, and this story starts being retold by the Spanish Catholic missionaries themselves. And it keeps evolving and being kind of manipulated to conform to the Spanish conquistador narrative. And what I mean by that is, at a certain point, I think in the 17th century, the story was told in the way that the sickly, deformed youth, which was the kind of cultural Aztec feature of the original account, was now described as an angel with a cross on his head. And the reason for the near-death experience was not a prophecy that the Spaniards were going to come, and to prepare for that, the reason was now that the woman was supposed to return and preach the news of Christianity to the Aztec people. And then by the time the 18th century comes along, it's a full-blown shining angel of light, and the woman has become the first woman to baptize the indigenous people, and she's practically canonized. And that version is actually accepted as truth by the Catholic Church, even to this day. There's songs about her in Mexico, so it became a kind of Mexican Catholic cultural phenomenon.
Well, I did do an interview with Carlos Ayer, who has a book out about levitations, and he describes this case of a nun in, I think it was around the 16th century, who had visions where she was flying out of her body, traveling to the New World and baptizing the Indians. And I think it's even here in the state of New Mexico, there's a statue of her. The Indians also reported this blue nun figure, this angelic being coming and baptizing them.
Wow, that's interesting. I mean, there's a lot of near-death experience accounts from Native American cultures as well. I mean, even at Taos in New Mexico, Pope, that rebellion seems to have been grounded in his NDE. There's not an explicit death context. He has a vision, but it's a vision of the other world. And in that, during that vision, he's basically told to, come back and start this rebellion against the Spaniards. And there are quite a few examples of that, of near-death experiences being used as a political tool, essentially. And I think the meaning behind that is that symbolically, it's an experience of renewal. And this message in the face of cultural threat is like a way of renewing the culture, is mimicking the near-death experience. So if we give the populace this power of rebirth, then maybe that's going to help us survive and thrive in the face of these external threats.
I understand that you have perfectly valid reasons for keeping your focus narrow on the near-death experience, but from my point of view, it's part of a spectrum of out-of-body experiences and mystical experiences and lucid dreaming and dreamlike experiences that they all give us access to various, I suppose to put it simply, various facets of our own depths. Of our own interiority, which would include, as far as I'm concerned, the afterlife. I think it's all within us.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think especially shamanic journey experiences are analogous to NDEs to the extent that they might even be accessing the same state. It might even be essentially the same kind of experience. It's just that it's done deliberately through whatever kind of practice is relevant to the culture. The ghost dance is a great example of that. A lot of people have heard about the ghost dance, but not many people know that it was founded on the NDEs of the prophets. They literally had NDEs, went to the other world, came back, and then decided to teach the people how to access the other world without dying through these practices of repetitive dancing, sometimes taking hallucinogens, drumming, doing all these kind of physical deprivation activities to the point that they would collapse with the intention of going to the other world and having this transformational sort of experience. So I almost look at them as shamanic near-death experiences. I think I've kind of grown to think of them in that way rather than looking at them as a separate kind of phenomenon.
And of course, I'm sure you know that there are scholars who say the ancient Egyptian religion is essentially shamanic, with all of the deities with animal heads, for example.
That's a speculation, but I think in that case, it's a good speculation. And just when you read the text and you delve into the kind of transcendental, mystical world that their consciousness was inhabiting as they were writing these texts, you do wonder, if they had access to altered states of reality, if not near-death experiences, then shamanic ones. But I do tend to give primacy to the NDE just because of, as I was saying earlier, that it's spontaneous. I think, and the ghost dance, again, is a good example. The spontaneous, unsought near-death experience came first, and then that led to the ritual practices and actually a change in religion. So to me, that's a good example of the way NDEs influence beliefs, practices, and religions per se.
And I know in this particular book, you've limited your study to the most ancient cultures that didn't interact with each other so that you can really try to get to a pure analysis. Because the closer we get to modern times, everything is all jumbled together with different cultures interacting with each other. Yet, of course, the near-death experience has had a powerful influence in more recent times as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also, as you know, looked at indigenous religions cross-culturally in Native America, Africa, and the oceanic area, the Pacific, comparing, that wasn't just looking at their afterlife beliefs, but through the missionaries, explorers, and ethnographers, going back from 16th century all the way till 1920s or something. That was kind of my cutoff. We have actual accounts of near-death experiences and people saying, we know about the afterlife because so-and-so went there and came back and told us about it. So that's, to me, indisputable evidence that these experiences are impacting beliefs around the world. And if it's happening in these societies, it's happening it's in ancient times as well. And as you said, in modern cases, they might not be generating new religions, although that's sort of debatable. They sort of are. They're definitely changing individual people's beliefs. A lot of people, almost everybody comes back and says, I no longer have a fear of death. Some people are actually looking forward to their death, while also realizing that they need to engage in a more positive way in this life, and live this life as best they can. And then we have, like within the International Association of Near-Death Studies, for example, they have the research side, and then they have the experiencer side. And if you go to one of their conferences, the experiencer side really is like a kind of new religious movement. It's not about research. It's not about evidence. It's about sharing experience and creating a new belief system based around those experiences. And to me, that's almost the definition of a new religious movement.
And I think it's probably fair to say that new forms of psychotherapy are emerging out of that organization, IANDS, and the focus on the idea that we know something about the afterlife.
Absolutely. Yeah. And also just the idea that with people like Peter Fedek, for example, and Sue Brain, they wrote a guidebook for clinicians, people who work in hospice or in hospitals, the cardiac wards or whatever, just to educate doctors and nurses about near-death experiences. So when people come back and talk about them, they're not stigmatized and not made to feel like they're crazy or whatever, to listen to them and the value of listening to them and how that can actually facilitate their rehabilitation.
Well, Gregory Shushan, this has been eye-opening, enlightening, and informative. I really appreciate the breadth and the depth of your knowledge. So thank you so much for being with me.
Thanks so much for having me on, Jeffrey. It's a pleasure.
It's been a joy. And for those of you who are watching or listening, thank you for being with us, because you are the reason that we are here.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue number 8 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine or order a beautiful printed copy, go to newthinkingaloud.org.